Hello, everybody. Welcome to the lecture series sponsored by the Center for Area Studies at University of Delaware. The Center for Global and Area Studies sponsors a lecture series every year. And this year it's sponsoring this lecture series, which is called Religion and Politics in Secular Democracies. And unlike in the past years, this year the lecture series is also co-sponsored by the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C., a Washington, D.C. based think tank that focuses on geopolitics. It is also sponsored by the Institution for Culture, the Institute for Culture, Religion, and Politics at Washington College in Maryland. This particular lecture today is going to be given by a very distinguished journalist, Ravi Agrawal, who is currently the managing editor of the Foreign Policy magazine, which most of you probably read, and if you don't, you should be reading. He was also the bureau chief of CNN in Delhi for nearly 10 years, has won a Peabody, has been nominated 3 times for an Emmy, and he went to Harvard, and he is one of the smartest analysts, I think, on South Asian politics. So without much ado, welcome, Ravi.
Thank you. That's a very generous introduction on your part.
Thank you for agreeing to do this. I would have loved to have seen you on campus interacting with students, but maybe we will do this again next year or in the near future. So I want to start off by talking to you about the rise of what we call as the Hindutva movement or Hindu nationalism in India. Can you tell us a bit about Hindu nationalism and its rise in Indian politics?
Sure. Now, I mean, Hinduism, of course, is a very old, one of the oldest religions in the world, but the idea and the notion of Hindu nationalism is actually quite new, relatively new in that sense. The first sort of notions of organizing Hindu society along those sort of religious lines, I think, came about with a Hindu reformist group known as the Arya Samaj in the mid-19th century in India, perhaps as a result of British rule at the time, which was organizing Indians along religious boundaries and religious lines. And in those days, the Samaj would often debate, among many other issues, the notion of Hindu unity, Hindu identity, Hindu society, but not in a way that was actually strictly acted upon in terms of unifying various Hindu groups. You saw other Hindu groups in those days also having similar sort of interests and areas of studies, such as the Sanatan Dharma Sabhas. But I would say that the real impetus behind Hindu nationalism came about in the 1920s. And this was after the 1923 publication of Veer Savarkar's book, Hindutva, Who was a Hindu. And Savarkar, who was a former sort of anti-colonial revolutionary, began to translate the idea of Hindu unity into that of a Hindu nation state. And it was around about that time, in 1925, that the upper caste Brahmin Keshav Hedgewar founded the Hindu Nationalist Association, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS. This is a group, obviously, that exists to this day, almost like a paramilitary group, which would focus on organizing groups of Hindus, conducting community service, and also responding to what was then seen as the emasculation of the Hindu male, which they responded to by organizing martial drills, martial games, sort of march pasts, activities like that. Now, fast forward to today, and the RSS probably has 50,000 units. It organizes Hindu festivals. It codifies rules on not eating beef, conducts community service programs and things like that. But crucially, and the reason why it is so relevant nationally in such a powerful way, is that in 1980 it gave birth to the political wing of its party, and that became known as the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP. This was in 1980, and the BJP has gone from, since that time, being a seemingly sort of fringe party appealing to people purely on religious grounds, as a party that, was seen as one that wouldn't really ever rule at the center, to being essentially the most dominant party in Indian democracy. So in 2014, the BJP became the first party in 3 decades to win an absolute majority. It had enough seats to come to power on its own, which was such a reversal of sorts over the last 30 years, where you had seen a trend of Indian elections leading to more sort of fractionalization of the electorate with more parties. The famous line, you don't cast your vote in India, you vote your caste. And then that sort of trend, which reversed in 2014, many analysts at the time saw it as a black swan event, but it was repeated once again in 2019 when Narendra Modi's BJP came back to power, this time with even more seats than the last time, 303 seats, I believe, and a vote share of 37%. And we can talk about this some more, but essentially the rise of Hindu nationalism now has firmly sort of been solidified, not only through this sort of the intellectual idea of what it means to be a Hindu through this group, through the RSS, through the community work of the RSS, through Savarkar's writings, but I think much more powerfully today in a political way through the BJP, which has been able to enact many of the ideas and themes and desires of the RSS at a national level, with the aid of a leader, Narendra Modi, who is charismatic, who has been winning elections, but who also crucially has such a command over the media in that he can appear in front of the people at the drop of a hat and can televise all of his speeches. So, in a sense, never before in India's history has the Hindu nationalist movement been as powerful as it is today.
It is interesting that you went all the way back to the 1980s to talk about it. I was in college. I was, I think, maybe first or second year engineering when L.K. Advani started the Rath Yatra. He went around all over the country, practically trying to take a brick, I think, from every village in India in order to go and build the Ram temple in Ayodhya. And it was also, I think, during that same period that the only television channel that we had in India at that time, Doordarshan, started telecasting Ramayana as a series. It was like a big production. I remember I saw the entire Ramayana while it was live telecast on Doordarshan. That was the only thing that we could see that day. I think it was telecast on weekends. So there has been a kind of a state-sponsored Hinduization of the culture of India, even before BJP became much more powerful. So there are some people who argue that the seeds of Hindu nationalism were sown through the soft Hindutva of the Congress rather than the BJP. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. And I too grew up watching the Ramayana in the early 1990s on Doordarshan before cable TV came to India. And then the Mahabharata as well, which was a sort of a successor epic, as it were, to the Ramayana. But look, it's fair to say that the Congress Party itself, which is the secular sort of party, one of the founding parties of India in a sense, but it too realized quite quickly that Hindus comprise of 81% of the population, and much as though the Congress set out to appeal to Indians of all stripes, of all religions, it's fair to say that I think it was Rajiv Gandhi who ended up the prime minister at the time who commissioned the making of Ramayana, which then aired on Doordarshan. I think he realized that it would have a broader appeal and that it sort of appealed to this sort of Hinduization of Indian society would perhaps be even useful to the Congress Party. So I don't think that at the time they even had begun to realize how the BJP could cash in on sort of the politicization of Hinduism, of the religion, of depictions of Ram as this martial protagonist of the Ramayana. For your students who don't know much about the Ramayana, Ram is often, who is a deity of sorts, is often depicted as this idealized human being who is both valorous but just. He is depicted in many Indian books, the Ramcharitmanas, for example, as the embodiment of the ideal Indian, the ideal Hindu, someone to aspire to. And so, in many ways, these depictions that became so popular in Indian culture ended up becoming the very things that the BJP would co-opt in its movements. You mentioned the Rath Yatra, for example, and that was essentially designed around the culmination of building a temple to the god Ram at a disputed site in Ayodhya in the middle of India. And the reason why that site is disputed is because at that very site was a mosque, the Babri Masjid, which was built by the Mughal ruler Babur, as the name suggests, and that was demolished in the 90s and after the Rath Yatra. And the movement to build a Hindu temple on that very site, which some Hindus say is the site of the birth of the deity Ram, that movement culminated a few months ago with the Supreme Court ruling, which has allowed now the Hindu petitioners to go ahead and build that temple, which the BJP has promised it will do. So that is something we may see in the coming months or years. But really, the point you raise of how the rise of Hindu nationalism not being just purely something that the BJP did on its own is quite true. I think the other parties played a role as well.
One of the interesting things as a political scientist, we talk about transitions to democracy. And some political scientists, and in fact, most people in the comparative politics field argue that for a authoritarian state to truly become democratic, it has to have at least two peaceful transfers of power. So people are so thrilled that Tunisia has had two elections and they have had two peaceful transfers of power. Now we have witnessed, first of all, after a long time, India has come out of coalition politics, and you see one political party actually winning an absolute majority. And BJP and the Hindutva party has done it two times in a row. So it has successfully elected. So is it safe to perhaps argue that India is already a Hindu Rashtra? Subramaniam Swamy, this very prominent BJP spokesperson, who also sometimes says wacky stuff, which is probably why you're smiling, claims that India is already a Hindu Rashtra and we don't need to do anything more to make it a Hindu Rashtra. But these two consecutive victories by BJP, do they tell us that perhaps the Hindu impact, the Hindu nationalist impact on Indian democracy is now firmly embedded and may be there for a long time? Or do we think the fact that they won only 31% the first time, only 37% the second time, which suggests that still 2 out of 3 Indians are not in favor of this movement, may raise some hopes for secular, democratic, pluralistic politics in the future?
It's very difficult to say. I think one thing is clear, which is that at national elections, people aren't just simply voting for the BJP. I think they're also voting very particularly for Narendra Modi, because in him they see someone who, as I said earlier, is charismatic, is a very good orator, is someone who talks about development and the construction of roads and bridges and buildings, and has sort of often, similar to how Donald Trump often talks about making America great again, often uses the rhetoric of making India great again, of harkening back to this era where India was a relatively more powerful nation. Some of that I think is seductive, and the problem with any kind of promises or the building of seductive hope is that if you don't deliver, you're in trouble. And I think the writing's on the wall in terms of how India's economy has been performing over the last couple of years. The jobless rates are at their highest in 45 years. It is very clear that the economy had begun to slow down a fair bit over the last 3 or 4 years, perhaps starting with demonetization in 2016, when Modi quite erroneously recalled India's 2 highest currency cash notes, comprising 86% of all cash in circulation, and then replaced them, thereby making it very difficult to do business for several weeks for small traders and people who dealt in cash. But there were several missteps on the economy that have been made that now, in sort of a COVID-19 pandemic era, are only going to get much, much worse. So India is going to enter a real slowdown In fact, maybe even entering a recession in the next few months. So, given all of those factors, I certainly wouldn't say. I mean, first of all, very difficult to make any predictions. But given the fact that Modi will not be around forever, given the fact that the economy is doing poorly, and at some stage that will end up becoming a referendum of sorts on Modi. And then third, much of the rise of the BJP and Modi's rise also has to do with the weakness of other parties, in particular the Congress Party, which at the time Modi was elected in 2014 was seen as not only weak but also corrupt and at the helm during many scandals. And so there was a mood of wanting to get them out. It's easy to see all of these things changing by 2024. So I'm reluctant to project beyond the next year, just given how much is going to change because of the pandemic.
When Modi won and the BJP came to power in the first term, I used to tell Indian Muslim groups here in the US and other places that we should pray for the success of Modi and BJP, because if he achieves his economic and governance goals, that is making India more transparent, making India less corrupt, making India a richer economy, everybody would benefit from that, including minorities and Muslims also. And when leaders have governance achievements, I don't think they need to then realize, then they don't need to turn towards hateful stuff, looking for scapegoats. And because now the governance agenda is really going down the tube, I mean, it's no leader in his senses would come out and say, "Oh, we are performing very well in India at the moment." That would be an additional temptation to turn to Hindutva politics and identity politics and try to say, "Look, yes, we may have messed up because of COVID, etc. However, it's not just about India's economy; it's about Hindu faith. It is about our God. And so, even though we are doing a terrible job of governing, please vote for us because we are the only saviors of Hinduism from Islam or Muslims and Christians." So that could be a turn that Indian politics could take, and that would move it away from secularism, move it away from democracy. And if you notice, this year India's rankings on democracy index have dropped precipitously. So I was wondering what you think are the chances of India remaining a democratic society in the near future.
So it's highly possible that Narendra Modi and the BJP could make that argument in 4 years, which is to say that vote for us to preserve the idea of India as a Hindu nation. I think that that is a less appealing sales pitch to the Indian population. I think even many Hindus are much more receptive to the idea of progress, to the idea of development, to the idea of fixing things, which was the basis of the original sort of seduction, as it were, around Modi and for Modi in 2014. I think that it's more likely that the Modi government would have to find another sales pitch because there's little evidence that India is so far gone in terms of it wanting benefits for Hindus above and beyond every single other thing. That said, the Modi government has shifted its agenda a fair bit, and that bears some thought. When Modi came to power in 2014, that was around about the time I was based in India as a correspondent for CNN and reporting on this story. At the time, Modi's sales pitch was mostly about making India more efficient, making it an easier place to do business, about bringing in foreign investment, about focusing on technology. Those kinds of things were what he would talk about the most. Come 2019 and right before the election, that began to change, where his sales pitch was driven more by fear. So there was tensions with Pakistan, and there was sort of a mood of sort of nationalism around those tensions, and Modi's pitch became, "I alone can save you. I alone can fix this. Those other guys can't do that," which may have something to do with a global mood as well, not just an Indian one. But what is very telling is that after winning this landslide election in 2019, truly a historic victory for the BJP. The fact that the BJP then went on an agenda to sort of tick off these age-old items on its manifesto, and those include, for example, building the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, which we mentioned earlier.
Sure.
It included the Kashmir decision to revoke its autonomies and bring it in line with other states in India. It included its decision to create a national register of citizens, all of which it passed through, if you think about it, in very quick order over the space of about 6 months through Parliament. And what is surprising about all of these things is that even though it was in the manifesto and people clearly voted for exactly this, what is less clear is that the people who voted for the BJP had a very clear sense that these things would actually be enacted because they weren't the last time round. So I think what remains to be seen now is in the next national election whether people still have an appetite for divisive, polarizing measures that the BJP has tried to push through. There is a chance that there's enough of a population that cares for these things, but I think secularists would like to believe that there's enough of a population in India that believes in the notion and the idea of India as a fundamentally secular democratic republic.
You know, I mean, there is a temptation to try to understand India's political direction based solely on the political developments in India alone. However, if you notice, we are also living in the age of populism. And since 2006, there has been a global decline of democracy. Even the United States does not qualify as a full democracy. We are now rated as a struggling democracy. We are not even in the top 20 countries which are democratic in the world today. So there is this rise of populism and the rise of authoritarian charismatic leaders like Donald Trump and Duterte in Philippines. We see Erdogan in Turkey and Putin in Russia. Xi Jinping has declared sort of that I'm going to be emperor of China till I die. So there is this rise of these charismatic leaders whose promises to the populace are more important than any criteria of how they govern, the legitimacy of their governance. Even Trump constantly expresses his admiration for authoritarian leaders and authoritarian tendencies. So is it possible that this global trend is partly something that helped Narendra Modi and BJP win in 2019, despite the fact that they were not performing as they had promised in 2014?
Yeah, and I think that would tie into what I was saying earlier about the failure of the Congress to come good on many of its promises. I think if you step away from India for a second and look at the wider sort of global picture, it's very clear that, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and this notion that more capitalism would fix everything, more democracy would fix all of the world's problems, which is really an idea that was the idea du jour for a good 30 odd years. It's only fair that at the end of that period, a bit of disillusionment set in across the world, in large part because of rising inequality, because of the forces of globalization, which lead to a lot of automation, a lot of centralization of power in the big cities, a lot of urbanization as well. All of these forces, I think, when you put them all together, there's been a global sort of disillusionment with, sort of the Blairite kind of, that's a reference to Tony Blair in the UK, sort of smugness with liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think much of what we've seen around the world is a response to that, this notion that these elites in the big cities who are highly educated, they don't necessarily have the answer. And I think Modi caught on to that very quickly when he began to criticize, the elites who were criticizing him, and his famous line that I have hard work, not Harvard.
Hmm.
it sort of encapsulates what he meant by that, which is this sort of hokey sense of, I might not be an elite, I might come from humble beginnings, but I'm here to fight for you. And that falls within the larger global pattern. You mentioned all those other leaders. There's also Bolsonaro, there's Orban, Boris Johnson to some extent. It's very much a global trend.
One of the developments that we see is that India, to a great extent, seems to be fixated on Pakistan, especially in this term a lot. And so the demonization of Islam and Muslims kind of is essentially a quasi demonization of, say, Pakistan. And that has also been one of, I think, the pillars around which Hinduization of India has taken place, as a reaction to the very existence of Pakistan, and not to mention cross-border terrorism episodes like the attack in Mumbai. I can't have a conversation with a politically engaged Hindu friend of mine for 5 minutes before he starts talking about Mumbai or Somnath or goes back into history. We watch Bollywood films these days, and there is a Hinduization of the history that is taking place. It's fascinating to see the kind of movies that are being now made, which are basically trying to project this idea of Hinduism and Indianism as one thing, one God, which is Ram, one language, which is Hindi, and one nation. So these ideas are being projected back into history. But when I look at leadership outside the Hindutva movement, I see no alternative. Like, who is going to challenge Modi? I don't see Rahul Gandhi inspiring anybody. There is nobody of any substance, at least in the Indian National Congress. Shashi Tharoor is the only one I really like to listen to, but I don't think Shashi Tharoor can give a speech in Hindi in Delhi or Bhopal and win it for Congress all over India. So do you see any alternative leadership, inspiration, or some kind of charismatic leadership coming? There are regional leaders who challenge both Congress and BJP, but nationally, do you see any future there?
Predicting the future with any politics is a fraught game. I mean, even in 2012, for example, it would have been a very brave person who would say that Narendra Modi would win a landslide election. So I think India has, over the years, the decades, has thrown up surprises pretty much all the time. And I imagine it will continue to do so. I mean, it's very easy in a moment like this to not be able to see beyond Modi. But remember, he's not that young. The economy is certainly in real trouble, and in a post-pandemic scenario, and I've written about how badly India could fare if there is a community spread of the coronavirus across the country. Um, It'll be very difficult for Modi to project any of these things as good news or as examples of good governance on his part. So, I think all bets are really off until the world sort of gets back to a semblance of normalcy in 2021. And who knows what kind of a world that's going to be and what shape global economies will be in. But to your point about Pakistan, you're absolutely right in that it's a very strange, not just a fascination, but an obsession with Pakistan. I've never understood that myself. I think part of it comes down to for any government to sort of unify its people, you need something to rally for, but you also need something to rally against. You need something to hate. And having Pakistan as this hate figure is a very convenient thing for successive Indian governments. This is not just a BJP thing. It is also a Congress thing. But also, I think if you look at the rise of the Indian media, especially on television and the cable television channels, which there's no body that sort of monitors what they do or checks them or forces them to adhere to ethical or journalistic standards. Many of them are said to be beholden to the current government, either financially or through other means. If you look at their reporting and their sort of boisterous, opinionated primetime anchors, many of them sort of foment this idea of Pakistan as the enemy, instead of really thinking about the most substantive issues, which is to say, how can India be a strong power globally? How does India compete with China? How does India be a better ally to the West? These are issues and debates that you don't see very much in public discourse in India, simply because the Pakistan idea and argument sucks so much oxygen out of the room.
I do think that the coronavirus pandemic is particularly special in the sense that it is definitely going to have an impact on the global balances of power. So some countries are going to suffer more than others, and the difference is primarily through the economic fallout, not so much as tragedies in terms of loss of life, but in terms of loss of production, loss of market shares, loss of wealth. It's going to distort the current arrangement, so to speak, of the global
Absolutely.
order. And as a result of that, I think India could come out suffering a lot more. But I see this anticipation of already trying to blame the mismanagement of corona epidemic in India on Muslims with this Tablighi Jamaat episode. I mean, the Tablighi Jamaat are not really the sharpest tool in the box, really. I call it as Islam for dummies, truly. But this episode where it is being spread, it's being projected as if the coronavirus in India is being spread by Muslims and is some kind of an Islamic conspiracy against India, even though there were temples and other religious events which were being held simultaneously while the Tablighi Jamaat was having its global convention. Not only that, even today and yesterday, I saw BJP leaders having their events where no social distancing was being maintained, etc. But do you think that already in the Indian media is preparing to exonerate the government of any responsibility of the negative consequences of the coronavirus epidemic and lay the blame squarely on Muslim minorities, which could then further lead to violence and more detrimental policies and politics towards Muslims of India?
I mean, it's a horrifying thought, but it's quite plausible. The media, certain sections of the media, I should say, have already begun to blame the Tablighi Jamaat as the sort of vectors or the bringers of the virus to India. Arnab Goswami, who in many ways is sort of the Bill O'Reilly of India, or Sean Hannity now, I should say. He, on his show on Republic TV, he said of Tablighi Jamaat that these are dangerous people. He called them lockdown cheats. He said they have compromised us all. We were just winning when they did everything to defeat us. That sort of language, creating an us and them, seeing them as an other, seeing them as not necessarily inherently Indian, it's not a coincidence. I mean, language like that is essentially designed to divide and to harm. The thing is, though, what I think, and I hope Indians will realize in the end, is that there was no way to really prevent the virus from entering India. I mean, even before the Tablighi Jamaat incident, India officially had about 1,200 coronavirus cases. The likely truth is it had several thousand, maybe 10, 15,000 cases. That community spread was already underway. And there is really no country on earth that can prevent this from entering in that sense, unless you're completely isolated. The way to look at the coronavirus, as we know, is not to stop it, but to prevent it from spreading too rapidly, which is where lockdowns come into place, which is where education comes into place. And then lastly, beefing up the healthcare system so that when people are ill, they have the right facilities and ventilators and hospital beds to get to them. Those are all areas where India has failed abysmally. Now, how this is actually spun is a different story. I mean, I take you back to 2016 and demonetization, which I mentioned earlier, which was, essentially a completely ham-handed attempt to sort of clean out corruption in the Indian economy. What it ended up doing was taking at least a percentage point of GDP growth off of the economy. That was spun in some quarters as a masterstroke, but in many quarters by journalists was rightly reported on as a very foolhardy economic decision. You may see the same thing now with the coronavirus, where on the one hand, Modi has won praise from some quarters in India for the lockdown, but in many quarters, including from me, a fair bit of criticism about how the decision was announced with only 4 hours' notice. Nary a thought for the 45 million migrant workers in India who are living in India's cities and needed to rush back home to their villages, but there was no transport to do so. You've all seen the horrific pictures of hundreds of Indians crowded together without thinking about social distancing, just trying to get home. There are millions of Indians who are homeless. There are hundreds of millions of Indians who live in slums across the country. They live in apartments where you have several people to a room. Social distancing is only as strong as the weakest link in that room. Food supplies are uncertain. I mean, really, India is a petri dish of potential calamities when it comes to the spread of any disease, let alone a virus that is highly infectious. So I think it's highly likely it will spread. I think it's highly likely that we will see, India reach Italy levels of spread and therefore deaths. And then once that happens, the blame will need to be laid somewhere. So serious questions will be asked, I think.
One of the scary things as I saw the videos and images of the migrant workers is that if you look at the United States, right now the concentration is in urban areas, in New York and Seattle area. So this is, in some ways, more of an urban phenomena, right? Coronavirus, uh, and this migrant workers leaving cities and going back to their homes in rural area would actually kind of globalize it within the Indian context. It will from urban to rural transmission. I'm sure there are many people who are going back to their homes and villages are already coronavirus positive, right? COVID positive, and they could be taking it back home. So it's a nightmare scenario just watching there. And I understand that India is still a developing nation with over a billion people, and the political outcome of this, as you have already said, is difficult to predict. But I fear for the minorities of India because irrational anger could be directed at them. I have one more question for you about this. Is more of a long-term kind of question. If you remember, in fact, I don't think you were with foreign policy, but I used to see a lot of these articles in foreign policy asking the question whether it was India or whether it would be China that would be the ultimate challenger to the US in the 21st century. Like in 2005 and 6, there was all this discussion, and a lot of people were arguing, saying that both the economies are growing, both are a billion people each. Uh, you know, they're not only just competing in Asia, they're also competing for graduate school admissions. They're competing for all this venture capital in Silicon Valley between Indians and Chinese, this global competition. And because Indians could speak English and because they were democratic, they had an edge over China. Now I don't see those debates anymore. I mean, now the question is, will India join the US in trying to contain China? So, where do you see this future geopolitical destiny of India, so to speak, in the next 20-25 years?
Yeah, India has started to deceive on many fronts. There's no doubt about that. I think what is key now is for India to not squander the advantages it has. And as you said, the main reason why it was seen as this sort of natural ally for the United States was the fact that it was a democracy. The US and India are the two biggest democracies on earth. That is what led Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, to say that these two countries could form a defining partnership of the 21st century. However, that partnership, whether it's formed or not, and there's still no real signs that that relationship is defining as of now, whatever that relationship is, it is still kind of defined in opposition to China. And I think that really shows the might and the growth of China. It's important to remember that China, the GDP per capita in China, so the average income is in the $8,000 to $10,000 a year range. In India, it's about $2,000 a year. So India, the average Indian makes a fourth or a fifth as much as the average Chinese is right now. That gives you a sense of just how far India has to go. And that's another thing it may have squandered, because unless India grows at double-digit GDP per year, it's unlikely that India can ever actually even come close to catching up to China. So given that India is going through what seems like a secular slowdown, given that it is squandering much of the global goodwill it had for being a democracy, given that there are clear signs from the financial community that, if India continues to have communal disharmony, that may serve as a disincentive to invest in the country. Given all of those reasons, I find it hard to see that India would come good on the hopes that many people have had for it over the last 10 years or so. That may change, as things always tend to change. But certainly India has underperformed. It has disappointed on expectations.
There's an interesting point you touched upon is when the Kashmir event happened, that the change of the Indian constitution and then the discussion on CAA began. I was posting on Facebook stuff which was critical of India, and I did mention that India would lose much of its soft power and its prestige and whatever little respect it had internationally. And there were lots of people, including a very good friend of mine, who said, "No, you are the only one who's talking like this. The world is not." But in the last 5, 6 months, nearly every major publication in the world has consistently been hammering negative editorials, tons and tons of negative op-eds and articles, consistently questioning India's democracy, India's pluralism, India's culture of religious tolerance. And I was thinking that if Modi and BJP had spent $1 billion trying to get this much positive coverage, they would not have been able to. So they basically earn literally billions of dollars worth of negative coverage for India. Do you think that is going to have a long-term effect in the way the world deals with India?
I think so. I mean, look, it's these things. It's a loose causality, but there's certainly a change in perception about not only how the Modi government is seen, but how India and Indians are seen. And these changes take time. It takes years, sometimes decades, for perceptions to build and to bed in among people. So it's difficult to say at what point this will become conventional wisdom or at what point it will embed itself. But, the comparison again to China is instructive here, because if you look at sort of the muscular way in which India under Modi and the foreign minister Jaishankar have sort of dismissed critics who are saying who are criticizing some of its moves in recent months. Jaishankar in particular,
Yeah.
very erudite, well-traveled foreign minister, former foreign secretary, former ambassador to the United States and to China, has sort of dismissed the New York Times and the Washington Post as papers that really no one should care about, in a way that you would imagine a Chinese diplomat would do, as they often do. But the thing is that India is sort of adopting China's muscular approach towards the media. It is adopting China's muscular approach towards transparency and how it treats its people. It is not adopting the other things that China has done so well over the last 4 decades, which is to have a very clear set of economic principles to unleash efficiency, to bring in global capital, to build new towns and cities, to bring on board all the provinces and governors and to pull in a single direction in a way that, in a sense, has never been done before in the history of the world. So I think there are two things here. One is perhaps all of us were wrong in the first place to think that China's miracle could ever be replicated anywhere else, let alone in India. And I think perhaps India's leaders also have miscalculated their own abilities and have taken the wrong lessons from China, because you can be muscular and boisterous, but you do need to have performance to back it up.
Yeah, you need to have muscles to be muscular, really. One last question. Do you see the rise of Hindu nationalism in India manifest in the diaspora, particularly in the US? We had this very curious episode of Joe Biden, the leading Democratic presidential candidate, appointing a person to outreach with Muslims in the U.S. And he had all these pictures with Modi, and is known to be a very pro-Hindutva activist, and it kind of created some kind of tension within the Biden campaign itself. So there is a very clear indication that the Hindu and Indian diaspora in the United States has been quite enamored with Narendra Modi. And do you think that the negative backlash against Modi and India may also uh, turn towards Indian diaspora in the US and in the West?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, look, the Indian diaspora in the US does read the New York Times and the Washington Post and foreign policy. So they are certainly seeing the criticisms of Modi and his government and his moves over the last year at the very least. Not only that, if you look at especially the Indian diaspora in America, they have tended to be solidly Democratic over the last several elections, not Republican. Assuming that that's the case still, which would then mean that they actually are consumers of CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and the Post, you would imagine then that they would begin to, at the very least, feel upset about the coverage that they're seeing of India.
Sure.
Part of the enamoredness that you described is not only an agreement of policy, it is also a feeling of pride, which is a quite simple one that, here we have a leader who is charismatic, speaks well, is trying to improve India as a destination for business. All of that kind of stuff, that language, that rhetoric, is stuff that appeals to diasporic Indians because they have something to feel proud of when it comes back to home.
It's
If
like
you
it's
reverse
like
that,
the Imran Khan effect on the Pakistani diaspora. They also feel the same towards him, right?
yeah, that's a good analogy to make. And so I guess what I was getting to is that the flip side of that analogy is that if leaders who are charismatic and speak well, such as Modi and Khan, uh, if they engender pride because of their demeanor and their charisma, then they will also have the opposite impact if they are heavily criticized in the West. So, in that sense, the critiques of the media, even though they may be dismissed in India itself and may not have a wide following in India, they do matter in that they are consumed here.
Well, that was very, very enlightening, Ravi, and thank you very much for taking your time out and speaking with us. I hope you are practicing safe distance, social distancing, and being safe. I am an avid reader of your South Asia brief, and thank you very much. And inshallah, I will try my best to bring you back to campus once we are out of this terrible pandemic that we are all suffering. So, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me on. I wish I could have been there in person, but I suppose it's best for all of us that we maintain social distancing. So thank you for having me on via Skype.
Thank you.